afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our session. If you're here, you are in the session, Smart Cities Are Not the Same as Resilient Cities. And I am Deb Niemeyer, and I'm the moderator of this session. I'm joined by three brilliant, younger than me scholars whose research focuses on identifying and examining structural inequities in the built environment. And we've structured the panel so that each panelist, and I'm going to share my screen right now to show you a few slides I have. We've structured the panel so that each panelist has about 10 minutes or so for a presentation, with about 5 minutes of Q&A at the end, and then we'll come back at the end and open up the session for a broader Q&A. So I also want to take this moment to say thank you to AAAS and to the staff that has helped put this conference together. I live in DC, and I've often gone to this conference, and it's tough to keep the kind of comfortable feel that you get from the conference, and it's been done really well. So thank you to AAAS for this. So before we start, I want to take a few minutes to briefly introduce our topic and hopefully spur some initial thinking with our audience as each panelist begins to present. And one way I'm going to do this is argue that the pandemic has brought to bear many issues associated with technology. And we can use these issues to examine the basic premise underlying what is defined as a smart city. We can then juxtaposition the smart city premise against a basic human right, which for the purposes of this we'll refer to as access to infrastructure. And here I'm flipping infrastructure definitions a little bit, in the sense that I'm extending the definition of access to infrastructure to include elements that we don't normally think of as basic infrastructure, like science, like technology, like healthcare, like food, like education. By redefining infrastructure in this way, we can then begin to focus on the human or individual side of access. So, for example, in this redefinition, transportation would not be an infrastructure system in the way we normally think of it. It is simply a technology we use to deliver access to basic infrastructure of science, food, healthcare, clean energy. And if we redefine in this way, we can begin to directly measure how infrastructure functions against human rights. And human rights are at the individual and community scale. So we can look at access issues then very directly under this umbrella of human rights. Now, scholars are very excited about smart cities and technology in general as a way of mitigating sort of long-term inadequacies. For example, in Africa, technologies have allowed many countries to leap into cell phone use without traveling through the landline experience. Also, as a result, access to banking and banking infrastructure has changed. In the US, we point to faster and more efficient network technology as a key part of smart cities, and this is a big part of our dialogue about smart cities. And this manifests, for example, as the Internet of Things, which is supposed to improve access. But if you delve a little bit deeper, you're struck with questions about what infrastructure the IoT will actually improve access to. You begin to see how consumers actually feel about the Internet of Things, or the IoT, and the kinds of issues that emerge around privacy rights and how data moves through technologies, its algorithms, its storage, and its production and consumption. And you can see that focusing on data, you can see this aspect by focusing on data in this slide that I have. Let's see if I can get it going. Oh, there we go. That I have taken these simple word clouds and I've characterized the funding that NSF, the National Foundation, is directed toward two smart city initiatives. The first was in 2017 and the second in 2018. And here what you see are these words like technology, network, design, data, all figure very prominently. And if you step back from this a little bit and you think about, okay, let's, as an alternative, consider the definition of resilient cities. Here we find the term loosely refers to the ability to recover from a setback. And technology is not a necessary component of resilience. Individual recovery is. So in the case of our recent pandemic, what you'll hear from is Professor Beerbaum will show that this might mean the ability of the educational infrastructure to quickly recover from a shutdown and return to basic service delivery. Or as Professor Palmer will describe, the ability of a transit system as a transport technology to continue to deliver safe access to infrastructure like healthcare or food. So in these kinds of settings, technology seems to be an important but not essential ingredient of a resilient city, while smart cities don't seem to require resilience at all, only technology. And in fact, if you do some simple word counts on these abstracts for NSF funding grants, what you'll see is that you'll find some form of the word resilience barely appears in any of the abstract words, and sustainability barely appears. And smart and technology appear a great deal. So while this is hardly a scientific study, it does suggest that smart cities, or the scholars who study them, do not typically themselves with resilient cities, nor does it turn out do they concern themselves much with infrastructure as I have defined it. And you can see this by looking at, if we take these infrastructure sectors in this expanded definition, very few refer to food or energy or education or healthcare or ecosystems. And these are you could look at. So in the final presentation, what will happen is Professor Karner will describe the laws and guidance and highlight how we regulate technology. And in this case, the technology being the transportation that delivers you to infrastructure in this expanded definition. And here, listen to this presentation, I want to think about human rights, the rights that exist because you are a human being. The civil rights that Professor Karner will talk about are that arise out of a legal granting right. In other words, with this presentation, we're going to urge you to consider how the human right to access differs from the civil right that we confer through the laws and guidance of technologies, and in this case, transportation technology. So with that short sort of setup for our group, I'll start with Professor Beerbaum's research. As a brief bio, Professor Beerbaum's research examines the links between planning practice, urban politics, and public education. Her research builds understanding of how planning supports or hinders educational equity and racial justice for historically marginalized youth and families, and how public schools play a role in urban planning and governance. She is particularly interested in the ways that policy and planning for neighborhoods and schools as distinct and intertwined endeavors create landscapes that codify race and class hierarchies endemic to the United States social, political, and economic structures. So with this, I will stop my share and hand it off to Ariel.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you see my presentation. So thanks for that introduction. As Deb said, I'm a professor of urban studies and planning, and as she described in my bio, as a scholar of urban planning with a focus on public education, much as Deb sort of has an expansive definition of infrastructure, I study and approach public schools a little differently than many other educational researchers. Specifically, I think of them as fundamental infrastructures in communities, one that serves not only their obvious educational purposes, but also as critical social and physical infrastructure in neighborhoods, cities, and regions. I think most about the spatiality and built environment dimensions of public education, and therefore consider questions of educational justice as questions of spatial and environmental justice. I ask really expansive questions about the ways that our non-school environments and systems set up the necessary precursor conditions for learning, and also look into possible interventions, not only for educators and education policymakers, but in non-school arenas that can mitigate injustices, as was already described. So I'm really excited to be here today and engage with this community and sort of grapple with these questions of a human rights framework and how it can advance questions of justice and public education, as was just mentioned, particularly in the context of the US legal structure, where education has sort of a precarious position, even as a civil right within the US Constitution. So today I'm gonna sort of talk through the ways I think about this public infrastructure with two examples. I'll focus on the COVID crisis, and I'm gonna draw some examples from Baltimore City, which is a place that I've been working most recently in and with folks around these issues. So I first want to highlight the ways that schools serve as social infrastructure, and I perhaps should say as social safety net infrastructure. For children and families living in poverty, and for many, many communities of color, the school building simultaneously activates a key pillar of the US welfare state, where students, their families, and actually also members of the broader non-school community in a surrounding neighborhood receive services from free meals to flu shots. So what happens when a school closes, right? They can close permanently or suddenly, like in this current COVID moment. And really, the closure of these school buildings deactivates these same resources, even if the district and the school site is able to pivot and continue to carry on with online or remote teaching and instruction. And so closed school buildings result in a loss of routine childcare that makes going to work every day possible for the 11 million parents in the country with school-age children who live in poverty. We have about 13 million children experiencing hunger in the United States, and these kinds of closures disrupt a critical source of food, sometimes their main source of food, for 2 to upwards of 3 meals a day. And for the nearly 1.5 million K-12 students experiencing homelessness, school closures remove a really important source of stability and access to social workers and healthcare providers, both mental health and physical health providers. So schools are also physical infrastructure, right? The social service delivery that I just described is most often facilitated by the fact that schools are place-based assets. They're located in a place, and it's often a physical center for the communities in which they're found. They often serve as an anchor and a hub for neighborhoods and local communities, certainly for social connection, but again, that is facilitated by their physicality. And if we look pre-COVID at least, right, every day, 50 million children and another 6 million teachers and other adults were inside one of the more than 100,000 school buildings across the country, right? And these are huge pieces of physical assets, right? It's 7.5 billion gross square feet across about 2 million acres of land in our country, right? And state and local governments actually invest more capital in K-12 public school facilities than in any other traditional, or how we traditionally think about infrastructure outside of the sector of transportation, outside of highways. But capital spending and sort of the physicality of buildings is actually a spatial justice issue because the large majority of capital construction is funded by local taxpayers. The ability of school districts to pay for major renewals or new construction is tied to the wealth of the community, perpetuating inequity in school facilities conditions. So this is where we see the convergence of educational and spatial justice. The parochial structure of school district boundaries that is grounded in a history of segregation and racist land use and housing policies and local property tax structures means that low wealth communities, and often communities of color, have fewer resources for their school buildings, right? And we know from actually a June 2020 GAO report that was put out looking nationally at the condition of school facilities, found that affluent districts spend over $1,000 per student annually, while high poverty districts spend around $700 per student. We also know that what they're spending those things on is tremendously inequitable. Now, this spatial justice issue actually becomes an environmental justice issue when we start considering how that funding disparity translates into the condition and maintenance of school buildings in these communities. So it's estimated that in the national spending on school facilities is about $46 billion per year for both capital construction and maintenance and operation, right, per year. And that same GAO report actually found that 1/3 of public schools in this country are estimated to have inadequate heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And as you see in these photographs, which come from the city of Philadelphia, these are not unique to the city of Philadelphia. We see this in other urban, suburban, and rural communities across the country. You have mold, you have asbestos, you have leaking pipes. And these are in active classrooms that students are learning in and that teachers are working really hard to teach in. And we know that these conditions, we have very good empirical evidence and an increasing body of empirical evidence on the ways that these kinds of conditions negatively affect not only academic outcomes, but the physical and mental health of students, teachers, and the other adults in the building. Okay, so what of technology, right? What of the smart solutions? So when we think about ed tech and sort of a turn to smart solutions in education, there's usually a focus on educational games or apps, access to laptops. When we talk about in the classroom, we also often see smart whiteboards and those kinds of digital infrastructures that are put in as in-class products to really build that are built to improve curriculum and curriculum delivery. And certainly the needs for hardware and internet access have become more salient in light of COVID, right? But I think that actually COVID probably challenges us to think about building condition in new ways to extend to the materials of other infrastructure, right? Like internet, and for learning, and also actually to think about housing, right, as a core educational infrastructure. Now that we have so many students learning from home, right, what does that environment look like? And the digital divide is real, and it's tremendous, right? So certainly the facilities conditions I described extend to digital technology, to internet access. And really, when schools pivoted to online instruction this past spring, districts had to figure out how to get kids computers or tablets so they could have access to even baseline coursework at home, right? So in Baltimore, that meant actually procuring tens of thousands of Chromebooks over the time of mere weeks. It meant creating a triage system to figure out which students should be prioritized for those materials. It also meant actually finding things like power cords, because they actually had a cache of Chromebooks in school, but they live on carts that charge them. And so they didn't actually have power cables, right? So what did Baltimore do? Well, they actually sort of partnered, right? They created different sources of access by partnering with nonprofits, private donors, corporations, to get as many pieces of refurbished and new equipment as they could in that moment. We also saw that access to internet was a huge barrier. So even for kids that had devices in hand, could they even use them? This LA City Councilman tweeted this photograph of young people using Taco Bell Wi-Fi to log into their classrooms. Conversations with state education leaders across the country, public schools were creating hotspots in school or public library parking lots for drive-in homework sites. And Baltimore, again, this photograph is of 3 young people in West Baltimore that were helping to install wireless mesh networks on top of a school. The school district became an expert in mesh networks. It was installing them. They also spent hours negotiating with Comcast for at-home, low-income access for internet, and also partnered with folks like T-Mobile. But I also want to highlight the ways that this kind of pivot also meant that many districts, Baltimore included, coupled these kinds of responses with other kinds of low-tech technology, right? And so they were using television and radio broadcasts. They were setting up telephone hotlines and helplines, and they were actually delivering paper packets of schoolwork to children as well, right? So how they were pivoting to be a resilient district to respond to this crisis was actually sort of through a range of strategies. And now that schools are reopening or going hybrid, right? Actually, the access to internet is so important, but these questions of the building facilities condition and building technology are actually coming to the fore. So as the science of aerosol transmission has become more clear, and the direction and recommendations around that are more obvious and important that everyone's trying to follow them now, schools have to reckon with their indoor air quality. All that mold, windows that don't open, these aging HVAC systems. These things really matter, right? And if you remember that stat from earlier, a third of US schools don't have adequate heating, ventilation, or air conditioning systems, right? And that's ventilation for non-COVID conditions, let alone for the additional circulation that we're learning is necessary to combat what's going on, right? And again, you can see this tweet on the left from a Boston public school teacher, right? This is the low-tech solution. An open window and a box fan is how she's trying to get back into her classroom and get back to her kids as she wants. So much like I argue that schools are more than just educational infrastructure, right? The technologies needed to create this access, right, are more than just the hardware or the apps or the building technologies, right? And so, the high and low tech were really important. And I just want to use one of the social service gaps that was created by COVID closures for a minute. So when we talk about food, a recent study estimated that the 9 weeks between March 9th and May 1st, more than 1.15 billion meals were not served in school because of the school closures. Now, that didn't mean kids weren't getting fed, because districts pivoted really quickly. And so, for example, in Baltimore, they had already delivered 500,000 meals to young people, to families, to older adults, by April, right, which is when this slide that was presented by the city and school district did that, right? And their approach used a model of collective impact. It involved hundreds of partners, community-based organizations, other public agencies, philanthropy, corporations, and it was based on existing data and spatial analytics and grassroots organizing. It was complemented by a number of neighborhood-based mutual aid efforts to get food out. So again, when we think about access to this fundamental need, this fundamental human right of food, the way the district was able to respond was really tied to sort of a very diverse set of quote unquote technologies. So, as Deb had already alluded to, right, and that we'll hear about from Matt and Alex, and I, in my work drawing on sort of urban and planning critical theory, the tools of governance are also a set of technologies, right? So zoning, municipal finance structures, land use planning, mechanisms for housing and school finance, these are all technologies at play. And so our innovation in these of public administration, of collaborative governance and partnership and planning and policy, they've been used historically and continue to be used today to marginalize and deny access to health and wealth for communities of color and for people living in poverty. But again, if we understand questions and problems of education injustice as problems of political economy and the result of these generations and cumulative harm of policies and ideologies, you suddenly start to take a step back, give ourselves a little bit of breathing room to step away from these sort of high-tech digital solutions that come to the fore in the conversations around smart cities. And we really need to grapple with the durable structures of policy, public finance, and public administration that have created these conditions of persistent racial inequality and injustice in educational opportunity. And it's only when we do that, right, when we really grapple with the problem, can we identify the right set of solutions, the right set of technologies that are demonstrative of some kind of reinvestment in and an affirmation of fundamental human right to educational and healthy and high quality systems of public education. So that's it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. Deb, you're muted.
And there we go. Okay. So at this point, thank you, Ariel. We'll take a couple of questions if there's any questions. We have time for one or two. If we have any that have come up yet.
I'm not seeing any in the chat just yet, but the audience has been invited. So any that show up, I'll pass along.
Let us know. Great. Thank you. And so with this, we'll now turn to Professor Palm. And I'd like to read a little bit. He's a brief bio for him. Professor Palm's research and teaching are concerned with building inclusive, sustainable communities, and specifically his recent work focuses on affordable housing in Australia and California, and transportation justice and equity in California and Canada and the United States. So Alex, I'll let you take on at this point.
And by Alex, I think you meant Matt.
I mean, Matt, sorry.
No worries, it's Zoom. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Palm. I'm an assistant professor in urban studies at Worcester State. I'm going to be presenting some research that I participated in at the University of Toronto when I was working there. And so I want to start by just quickly setting the stage. As I'm sure you know and are familiar with, mode share for public transit dropped precipitously when COVID-19 went into effect, as our public health agencies advised residents to only use public transit for essential services and to avoid it at all costs. At the same time, a lot of cities across North America and the world have been responding to the problem of public transit no longer being seen as safe by, in some cases, intensifying existing efforts to promote active travel alternatives, and in other cases, launching new efforts to try and promote active travel. So thinking about all of these as the tools to providing access to the infrastructure of healthcare, of groceries, of work, of what have you, there was a big shift taking place in a lot of our cities, where cities are trying to promote these alternatives, including some new technology, new transport technologies like e-scooters and e-bikes, which are also taking off in a lot of our cities. Unfortunately, in a lot of our cities, this process has been highly racialized and spatialized in a way that may risk the reproduction of existing inequities in infrastructure, access, and availability in communities across our major cities. So here on the right is the latest map of Toronto's bicycle infrastructure network that they have conveniently provided here as an open source Google map. Here on the left is a map of the income distribution of Toronto around 2015. The blue areas indicate places where the individual incomes tend to be the highest, and areas where incomes have actually increased over the last 30 years. The red neighborhoods are the neighborhoods where incomes are lower and where incomes on average have been decreasing, or they've been rising slower than the region as a whole. So, Toronto is experiencing what some scholars in the US would call an urban inversion. It's also sometimes referred to as the suburbanization of poverty, in that increasing numbers of lower income households are locating towards the inner suburbs and peripheral suburbs of the major cities, where most of the existing public transit resources are not available, thus creating inequities where it's now more difficult for a lot of lower income residents in the city to continue to use public transportation and active travel to get to the destinations they need to go to, whether we're talking about getting to healthcare or accessing food. And you can just notice that it's in this gentrified core where most of Toronto's cycling infrastructure has gone up and continues to go up through the pandemic. So this motivated a team of us to start to look at who was continuing to ride public transit during 2020 and who stopped riding public transit, and to get an understanding of how people were responding to public health authorities advisory to stop riding. In a sense, this has played out as a kind of experiment where we're discovering, for whom public transit is essential and why, and what the impacts of losing public transit are on our residents. Toronto is an interesting city for documenting these changes and these problems because it has a very high public transit mode share, and at least up until maybe the late 90s was sort of considered a world-class example of a well-designed public transit network that provided widespread access across the city. So what we did in this period was we solicited surveys of current and former public transit riders across the city, mostly through social media ad recruitment. So with that, I need to put sort of a big asterisk on this conversation insofar as this is not a traditional research project that I'll be talking about today. It's not necessarily a representative sample. Our sample tended to skew heavily towards female identified respondents, and it also skewed a bit younger compared to transit riders. But at the same time, the data we've managed to gather does overrepresent some lower and low income households. So we feel that we have something to work with in terms of understanding what has happened to access to critical social infrastructure. The survey that we put in place went live about a day after the City of Toronto introduced very dramatic cuts to its public transit services. Canadian cities are far more heavily dependent on transit fares to generate revenue because they receive less federal support than public transit agencies do in the United States. The Canadian government doesn't see transit as its responsibility, and there's this sort of responsibility blame game that's been going on between the provinces and the federal government in trying to figure out how to support transit agencies. And again, one of the things I want to sort of point out here is that in some cases, some of the largest drops in public transit service in Toronto that resulted from COVID-19 map on pretty significantly to pockets and concentrations of low-income suburban households. This map, I should give a shout out, is courtesy of a PhD student at University of Toronto, Jeff Allen. So in this context of rapid investment in active travel infrastructure in a gentrified urban core paired with deep and significant, historically unprecedented service cuts to public transit in a city where 1 in 4 households do not own a vehicle, we wanted to understand what was happening to people's ability to access the essentials. And so one of the questions we asked exclusively of former public transit riders, which we would define as the people who used to ride transit once a week or more before COVID-19, but who stopped riding public transit during COVID-19. We asked this group that for lack of a better term, we'll call the temporarily former transit riders, whether or not giving up public transit has made it harder for them to access any of these essential infrastructures. And then in this particular figure, we bifurcate it by whether or not they owned a car. And so of course, as you would expect, it's maybe not that big of a surprise, but respondents who didn't own a car were far more likely to report that it was much harder to access these essential services without public transit, and as a result of their choice to forego public transit. And one of the things that drew our attention immediately was that among these different destinations where resources or infrastructure are located, it's actually the social infrastructure and the ability to support people in your social or familial networks or receive support from people in your social or familial networks was the access that was hit hardest when people were no longer to take public transit, right? And this becomes critical in the context of COVID-19, where a lot of people had extended family members or close friends who, for whatever reason, maybe they were at severe risk of a severe COVID reaction because of a pre-existing condition, would not want to go get groceries, but need someone else to go get groceries for them. We had a large qualitative open-ended sample where a lot of respondents reported that the biggest impact that giving up transit had on them was that they couldn't actually help other family members in other parts of the city who relied on them to get groceries, as an example. Similar results were reported for the ability to access healthcare. And then to a less extent, the respondents in this sample expressed difficulty getting access to groceries and pharmacies. So we also conducted a survey of people who were still riding transit amidst the pandemic. And one of the things we asked people to consider was, we asked people who were riding through the pandemic, what was the most important destination or service that they were currently reaching? And far and away was access to groceries. Now, this is a bit different than the sort of the popular media narrative around COVID-19 and public transit, is that essential workers are still using our public transit systems, and that's true. And on a day-to-day basis, most people riding transit may still be doing so for work, in part because grocery trips are taken less frequently. But among the people who were still riding transit, when we asked them to sort of think, of all the ways you're still using transit, what is most important? The most important thing you need to reach via transit, groceries and pharmacies come out on top far and away. So we're thinking here about, we're having conversations about the potential long-run impact of COVID-19 on our ability to provide high-quality public transit. What are going to be some of the consequences of this? It includes, loss of access to grocery stores and pharmacies. Several different demographic groups expressed the greatest concerns in our qualitative feedback. The former transit riders, or temporarily former transit riders, who articulated some of their greatest concerns tended to be older residents, residents with disabilities, and residents that our transit system isn't typically thought of as serving, like parents with children for whom getting a child to school without the bus could mean, a bit more difficult to do, or parents with young children for whom, taking the stroller on the subway to get where they need to go is actually easier than trying to walk everywhere. A lot of our respondents acknowledge that a lot of the active travel interventions that were being promoted by the City of Toronto and that are being promoted as are sort of, new technology solutions to transit being unsafe are actually very difficult for people with disabilities and people with chronic health conditions to actually participate in and benefit from. So in thinking through what are the potential long-term risks to people's access to healthcare and access to grocery stores in the context of a transit-reliant city like Toronto is, if political realities do not change and more resources aren't allocated to public transit systems, these agencies are going to start seriously paring down their networks, in turn potentially leading to long-term losses of access to transit-reliant populations. And in certain contexts, like Toronto, there was a sort of serious proposal pitched by the Premier of Ontario, Rob Ford, to replace most of the city's sort of least popular bus routes with Uber and Lyft, introducing a new set of questions and concerns about, whether or not some of the most marginalized riders in the city who live in those outer suburbs who depend on those low ridership buses will be able to access Uber, right? We're making an assumption that these riders have access to a phone, that they have access to a credit card, and that in turn they'll be able to use Uber in lieu of public transit. And finally, if ridership starts to crawl back up, as it's starting to do, will transit become crowded again, and how will this be ameliorated? And of course, anybody following the local news in a lot of our major cities will note that there's almost a daily headline about an incident of a picture of a crowded bus that's going viral. We have now developed the technology to be able to predict this in real time. And one of the things that is happening is certain companies that have access to data on bus counts are able to provide people with information in real time about how to avoid crowded buses. But the long-term question of, you know, when the COVID crisis ends, what will be left of our bus infrastructure to be able to serve populations on some of these routes? For those not familiar with the social geography of Toronto, these neighborhoods outlined in black are what the city calls neighborhood improvement areas. These are areas that the city has identified through a policy process as being systematically disadvantaged. And as a result, our neighborhoods, the city is trying to target benefits in. And of course, those happen to be the areas where bus routes are the most crowded. So, you know, the provocation for this piece is to ask, you know, for cities that are leaning heavily on active travel to minimize the impact of transit loss, who is left behind by this emphasis and what can be done about it? You know, many of these solutions and interventions are very promising, but they don't overcome a lot of barriers that may shut people out of traditional active travel interventions. You know, leading us back to what are we going to do to ameliorate the impact of long-term service cuts on transit-reliant residents. And before I quickly wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the support of a lot of our partner organizations and my co-authors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. So do we have any questions for Matt specifically? We're collecting the questions that the broader panel will address at the end of each of the presentations, but are there any specific to Matt? These are all big picture questions that have been posted so far. Okay, that's great. So I will now turn to Professor Carner. Dr. Carner's work aims to quantify the social equity, environmental, and public health implications of transportation using emerging data sources and developing new open source methods. He has a very deep commitment to practice, which undergirds his research and teaching, and he routinely collaborates with community members, nonprofit organizations, and public interest law firms to identify pressing needs and improve conditions in communities experiencing transportation disadvantage. And so with that, I'll turn over the mic to Alex.
Deb, we've had quite a few questions come in very quickly about the last presentation. I'm not sure how you want to handle that.
Yeah, so Alex, before you start, is it all right if we turn to Ariel? Okay, great. So Ariel, Jonathan, you want to read them out? Or for Matt?
Yes, 1 second. I just need to get these two things on the screen at the same time.
Okay, so I have them actually. So Matt, should the same study area in Toronto be done in other cities? And do you feel these results have helped make decisions among leaders?
That's a great question. I know that our work has fit into sort of broader advocacy efforts to preserve transit service in Toronto. But I know that sometimes the transit agencies themselves, they have their own panel data sets that they prefer to rely on for gathering this type of information. So I would say, yes, this type of data could probably help, but the key would be to try and get access to a representative panel because they definitely weighed our evidence as sort of less valid or useful than their own panel. Sans the qualitative stuff, which was certainly helpful to them.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question for you. As work organizations realize that teleworking is a viable option for employees, do you foresee bus routes being cut as transient riders may reduce permanently?
I would say that possibility operates on the assumption that buses primarily serve people in sectors that can telework. And I'm not quite sure that that's the population that bus populations serve in either Canada or the US.
Okay, thank you. All right, Alex, we will turn to you at this point.
Okay, great. Thanks, Deb. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. So as Deb mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of community regional planning at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm going to pick up on some of the threads that Dr. Palm just went over and that Deb kind of gave us at the beginning of the panel here today. So I'm going to cover 3 parts in my talk. First, I'm going to talk about how human rights are related to my kind of primary topic of study, which is transportation, equity, and justice. I'm going to argue that transportation, access to transportation that is affordable, reliable, convenient, and safe is fundamental to exercising human rights and realizing human rights across a number of different dimensions. And then I'm going to talk about the legal and regulatory frameworks that we have in place to nominally ensure that folks have access to the transportation resources they need to lead a meaningful life. And I'm going to be pretty critical about that kind of body of law and regulations. I don't think it's been as impactful as we would hope. And then I'll kind of close by talking about what I see as the future of ensuring that folks have access to the transportation resources they need, which I think actually has very little to do with the law and the regulations that we have on the books, and more with proactive practitioners, people that actually do transportation planning and traffic engineering, and regular people who live in cities across the United States and around the world becoming engaged and speaking up for change. And I think this last piece is going to get at one of the questions that was posed by a viewer. So I'm going to dive into this human rights and transportation equity and justice piece. So it's my view that exercising human rights, we can take an expansive view of human rights to encompass life, liberty, education, work, voting, and a number of other areas, requires either moving through space to get to work, to go to school, to interact with your friends and family, or staying still, right? Maybe you need to telework, you need to be at home, maybe you want to build a family, maybe you want to build wealth. That requires staying still. We know if we look around the world that the ability to choose to move or to stay still is not evenly distributed across the population. There are dramatic problems with climate refugees and other refugee movements around the world. These are folks who are being forced to move when they would rather stay still. And there are also people who are staying still when they would rather move, right? They want to be able to get out into the world and access all of these things that would help them increase their well-being, lead a meaningful life. And they simply don't have access to the transportation services that they would need to do that. So I think it seems clear to me that we can't realize universal human rights without fair transportation systems or thinking about this ability to move or not move. I have an example that's kind of hot off the press that should drive this point home. I've been really caught up in this executive order that our governor in Texas, Governor Abbott, passed a couple of weeks ago, where he required secure mail-in ballot drop-off locations across the state to be limited to 1 per county. And this was a problem in our most populous county, Harris, which contains the city of Houston. It's about 5 million people, almost 3 million voters. That county had proposed about 12 secure mail-in ballot drop-off boxes. So I'm showing those in blue in the map on the left here. You can see them kind of scattered around the county. And that reduced it to 1. So the 1 remaining secure drop-off location is in green here. It's a major sports arena. And I'm shading the map in terms of the travel time on public transit it would take someone to get to that secure drop-off location. You can see it's distributed. If you're close to a secure drop-off location, you can get there by transit pretty easily. When it gets limited into the 1 remaining drop-off location, things get really bad across the entire county. The numbers for public transit, we had a measure of people who we consider to be dependent on public transit. Their average travel time to the nearest drop box increased from about 40 minutes to about 75 minutes. So a major increase, and we know that when things get further away, people are less likely to take advantage of them. So here is an example where inequitable access to voting is being linked to transportation, the transportation systems that we have. So bring those 2 things together. So in my work on transportation equity and justice, I'm often thinking about how the transportation planning decisions that we see in the world, people thinking about the types of transportation infrastructure that we should build and where it gets placed, how that affects how easily people can reach opportunities, whether it's voting, work, school, social connections, healthcare, et cetera. And our transportation infrastructure also affects health and environmental burdens, things like air quality, exposure to noise and visual intrusions and related environmental problems. Our current system heavily disadvantages non-drivers. Non-drivers tend to, are more likely to be people of color and low-income people. And those same folks are more likely to be burdened by the existing system. And so in the desired state that I'd like to realize, which I refer to as transportation equity and justice, it would be one in which everyone has access to the transportation resources they need to lead a meaningful life, and no one is overly burdened. So we have some laws and regulations and various policies that are in place to help us ensure that everyone has access to transportation resources. I've got a table here. This is certainly an abridged table that's just showing a kind of sample of existing laws and regulations, executive orders, guidance documents that have been adopted by various federal agencies related to transportation equity and justice. I'm just going to dive in on two of them, two of the most important ones, and kind of show some of their limitations. So one that I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are probably familiar with is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? A kind of sweeping civil rights act that was adopted in the 60s that outlawed discrimination across multiple areas of American life. The one part of Title VI that I constantly come back to is this idea that no one in the United States shall be subjected to discrimination or denied participation in or denied the benefits of any program that receives federal financial assistance. This is where Title VI ties into transportation, because every transportation planning agency, whether it's a state Department of Transportation or a public transit provider or a kind of regional planning authority, receives some measure of federal financial assistance. And so they have to ensure that their policies and practices are not discriminatory. The way that they do that is often somewhat lackluster. That's where a lot of my research lies. And so through my work, I try to kind of strengthen Title VI's promise of non-discrimination. There's also Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice that was signed by President Clinton in 1984. 12898 does a few things. One, it brings low-income people into the fold, whereas Title VI only focuses mostly on people of color. The executive order brings low-income people kind of into the sphere of concern. It also gives some more specific language to this idea of the benefits of various federal actions. And it says that minority populations and low-income populations have to receive the benefits of federal programs. We cannot deny them benefits, we can't reduce their benefits, and we can't delay those benefits. So there are a number of issues with Executive Order 12898. One big one is that it's an executive order, so it doesn't carry the force of law. So if you are a member of a minority community or low-income community, you can't sue an agency or sue a kind of unit of government for violating Executive Order 12898. The other nice thing about 12898, or one nice thing, is that it mentions that it uses this language around populations, which I think is really important. So a lot of our analyses around environmental justice and transportation equity focus on neighborhoods or specific communities. But this idea of populations, so thinking about low-income populations or minority populations, causes us to think about impacts on people of color and low-income people, whether or not they live in a kind of designated minority community or a low-income community. And that has implications for the types of analyses that we conduct. Given my limited time, I can't really go into a lot of detail about the ways that agencies operationalize environmental justice and civil rights, but I'm just quoting a report here from Transit Center, a nonprofit organization in the United States that tries to promote public transit in US cities. And they say that the way that typical transit agencies comply with Title VI is basically by checking the box. And it's often focused on limiting further harm on people of color, but not actually thinking about the root conditions that lead to inequitable outcomes, and really trying to address those root causes. And this kind of harkens back to some of the stuff that Ariel was talking about earlier in the education realm. I did want to touch on the litigation piece. So thinking about using Title VI as a legal tool. You're actually pretty limited if you want to bring a lawsuit alleging a violation of Title VI. So there's a legal difference between intentional discrimination and disparate impact. Intentional discrimination requires someone at a transportation planning agency to actually be motivated by racial animus and to affect decisions in the world on the basis of that animus. This is incredibly difficult to prove. The last example I have from the transportation side that attempted to prove this was a case that was litigated regarding a transportation plan in the Bay Area. And the plaintiffs in that case actually lost that suit because they weren't able to argue that there were decision makers who were acting because of intentional discrimination or this racial animus. Disparate impact is a kind of weaker legal standard. So in a disparate impact case, all you have to show is that impacts differ across different population groups. You can't bring a lawsuit to allege disparate impact, but you can file what's called an administrative complaint, and then that gets adjudicated by the relevant federal agency. So it could be Department of Transportation or Housing and Urban Development. The problem with administrative complaints is that the veracity with which an agency adjudicates them depends on the political leanings of the administrator. So if you have an administration of one political party, they might pursue civil rights disparate impact complaints with more aggressiveness than an administrator from another party. So it's difficult to get relief in either of these two legal avenues. So we have strong laws and regulations, but they're actually difficult to enforce. And so I think the future of transportation equity lies not in legal battles, not necessarily in quantitative analysis, but actually from the people that are affected by transportation injustices. So I've got just a couple examples in my remaining time. This is an image that was taken from the Bay Area in 2012 as I was working on my dissertation. At the time, I was providing technical support to a coalition of advocacy organizations who are participating in a regional planning process. And this effort really taught me the power of an engaged base of citizens to advocate for and affect change in their communities. In this case, they were supporting this equity scenario, as they referred to it, a transportation and land use scenario. The scenario that they developed outperformed the agency's preferred plan, and it wasn't ultimately adopted, but they won key concessions. So they got some anti-displacement protections included in the plan and increased funding for public transit. And then the final example I'll talk about is the case of Clayton County, which is a county that's located in the south of the Atlanta metropolitan region. There, the public transit operator ceased service entirely in 2010, something which Title VI doesn't really tell us anything about. It had been operating for about 10 years. People organized their lives around it. And the county only got public transit service back because folks came together, fought for, advocated, packed public meetings, did a ton of social media outreach, and got voters to agree to pass a sales tax increase to fund public transit service in the county. And on this kind of theme of smart cities that we're talking about here, like the folks in Clayton County didn't advocate for Uber and Lyft to come in and save the day, right? They know that what they need is robust, affordable, convenient public transit that is going to stay there as a public good. They don't want a private company to come in, deploy service, and then leave as soon as it's not profitable, as we've seen with Car2Go, various scooter operators throughout the course of the pandemic. So I think the kind of public in public transit actually turns out to be quite important. So to conclude here, just reiterating the point that we have laws, we have regulations, we have policies around transportation equity and justice. We know that it's fundamental to achieving human rights, but they're not actually sufficient to achieve it. We can have, I think there's a piece here that is relevant for practitioners and planners inside agencies to pursue or not pursue transportation equity and related goals, and training and pedagogy is a key piece of that. I'm trying to bring this into the classroom as well. But I think that outside actors, just regular folks organizing, bringing people together and fighting for change is going to be key to achieving transportation justice going forward. So I'll stop there and I'll look forward to our kind of group discussion at the end here.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
So I think we'll watch the questions coming in. We have two fairly large questions that are posed to the panel writ large, and I'll put them together and then lay them out for whoever wants to jump in. The first, the question is, how does the work each of you are doing reflect on whether and how human rights should be taught in urban studies programs, and how do you use this language of human rights to talk about strategies that might work where actual human rights language would not be particularly effective? So it's two things. How do we teach professionals or work with professionals in urban studies about the human rights language, and then how do you talk about this stuff if the language of human rights is not effective? Somebody want to jump in?
So I can take a stab at it. I really appreciate the question, because actually to some of Alex's last points about pedagogy and teaching, right? We are researchers, but we're also responsible for teaching kind of the next generation of practitioners in this space. And I think each of us actually take that charge as seriously as our research charge. So I would say that in terms of how I try to educate and talk about this, I would say, first of all, my work methodologically, I use predominantly qualitative methods. Which means that my work is really about centering the voice and situating the voice of people and their qualitative, their lived experience in space, trying to essentially exercise these human rights. And I think that the power of narrative and story and figuring out how we can use qualitative methods and measures in our policymaking and in our planning is actually really important. And it's something that's tremendously underappreciated, I think, in sort of mainstream practitioner training. We're heavily dependent on kind of abstracted data and often quantitative data. And I think that the people can get lost in that. And so both in terms of engaging with the kinds of political action and coalitions and talking about sort of participatory engagement as both a practitioner and a researcher, like Alex described he himself does and does with his classes. I think we want to think about the modes that we're delivering that in as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that actually when I teach and I talk to folks, practitioners but more in my classroom, I emphasize to students that when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And that sometimes planning interventions are actually not the answer to the problem that we're asking. I have the privilege of teaching a planning history class. So I can talk about the ways that problem definition historically has framed things, right? And most often in planning history, right? Problems of poverty, for example, that folks in the planning field, we've chosen to frame those things as problems of housing or problems of infrastructure, not problems of access to resources, right? To money, right? It's not, we haven't framed it as a labor issue or a wage issue, because as planners, we instrumentally don't know what to do about that. And so I think knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know and being critical of our own profession is something that I try to bring to the classroom, and when I partner with public agencies to sort of push them along on that as well.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I can take a stab as well. Just one kind of follow-up point. I find, so I'm in urban planning now. My degrees are all in civil engineering, and I've had the pleasure of teaching engineering students as a professor. And I find that one kind of avenue that is useful for talking about this kind of stuff, and we can talk about whether I think it's slightly problematic, but just showing how there are other instrumental outcomes that derive from a kind of broader, more broadly achieving human rights, more broadly achieving justice and equity, whether it's talking about more sustained and long-term economic growth or better employment outcomes. Or in the case of the Bay Area example that I showed, the equity plan had reduced energy consumption, fewer greenhouse gas emissions that resulted from just having low-income people, setting up low-income people, giving them more opportunities to live near public transit where they can use it instead of driving. So sometimes those environmental or sustainability-oriented or economic indicators can help folks understand why these types of more abstract issues related to rights and justice are actually important.
Thank you, Alex. So I'll shift to the next question, which is, as smart city development increasingly encourages smart governance, we have seen a shift towards a technocratic governance by experts and technologists, and less emphasis on the democratic participation in governance, including things like citizen participation in design, planning, scientific and technological development of urban public space. So would you all speak for a few minutes about how a shift from the concept of a smart city to a resilient city might address this concern? And I'll just say that this idea of sublocal governance is actually a big problem. You finance infrastructure at a sublocal governance, and it creates these governing structures that are not democratically shared across a region. So, in that sense, the smart city could help to extend it to broaden the sublocal governance. But so, does anyone want to comment on the resilient part of the shift in perspective?
I can take a stab at that.
Okay.
So I have, I think there's a good example. I mean, I agree with the kind of the premise of the question,
right?
That there is this kind of idea of data, and more data collection, more sensors are really what we need when it's obvious that those things are not actually going to solve the fundamental problems that Ariel and Matt spoke to. There's a good example of a new type, new for the United States context, kind of democratic institution that showed some promise in a recent application. So I've been working a bit on participatory budgeting. So this idea that you have, you dedicate some share of municipal finances to be allocated according to the outcome of a binding vote undertaken by the folks who actually show up and participate in the budgeting process. And it actually asks a lot of local residents to come out many times and participate, but it seems to, it links their participation to a very concrete outcome, right? You will, if you come, you will actually get to vote and determine some share of this funding stream. And there are these kind of secondary and tertiary outcomes too, just like greater feelings of trust, more feelings of being connected with other residents, feelings of greater transparency in government, which I think we're kind of lacking across the board right now. So that's like a very low tech solution, but can actually get us, I think, some of the things that we're looking for in terms of broader equity and justice outcomes. So I think, studying those, continuing to pursue them is one kind of fruitful area of work.
Matt, Ariel?
Yeah, so I would just add, I also agree with the premise of the question, and I would actually extend it maybe sort of as to one precursor, that smart governance is actually a manifestation of neoliberal governance, where there's an increasing denigration of public goods and an increasing reification of the private sector. So in the transit examples, we heard about the turn, I think Matt mentioned in Toronto, that they want to move to having Uber and Lyft as a replacement for a public service, right? And then the example that Alex gave in Atlanta, the community knew that what they wanted was a reliable public good, right? And so I think we actually need to think about the configuration of our governance, and that the smart cities movement is actually a manifestation of a reliance on the private sector. We've ceded innovation and technology and problem solving and solutionism to the private sector, to sort of technologists. And we don't have to do that, right? So you could imagine a different configuration of that. And we see this in the education sector too, and why it's important and how it connects to resident and the public's participation is that when you have that shift in governance, you actually, it matters because you actually shift the subjectivity of the populace, which is to say that we, as the members of the public, cease to be citizens. We actually become consumers.
Right.
And so instrumentally, how we engage and the demands that we make and the power and claims that we have to public goods get disrupted or dismantled. And I think we actually need to think about a return to thinking of ourselves as part of a body politic, again, which is why the examples that Alex provided were so powerful. And then we need to sort of reappropriate the notion of smart governance in a different sort of return to sort of a different kind of democratic configuration. But again, smart cities it doesn't exist in the abstract. It's actually part of this constellation and this turn over this, the last 30, 40, 50 years towards the sort of neoliberal model of governance.
So Matt, do you want to chime in on this?
No, I think that sums it up.
Okay.
I'll definitely say everything Alex and Ariel both just spoke to help explain why Alphabet Labs' experiment in Quayside in Toronto failed, right? And failed pretty spectacularly. The official reason being COVID, but there were lots of serious issues over data ownership, access, privacy, and governance that were unresolved as it went under.
Right. That's a very good example. All right, so this is a question for Ariel, which is have there been any new recommendations about school building zoning as an update to those recommendations that emerged in the 1950s?
Schools, I wish I could ask for clarification. So school zoning, meaning like attendance zoning, these words have a lot of meaning. Okay, so what we know about sort of school buildings and where they should be, I mean, I think that's hotly contested and debatable, right? We see an increasing turn to school choice that has sort of a bifurcated history that comes out of both segregationist tendencies. So as actually the public good of education evolved to be more public and to be more inclusive through efforts towards desegregation of Black and brown communities, we saw many people sort of exercising choice to leave those systems, and those people were predominantly white and affluent, right, to find other means to segregate the schools. And so we see school districts responding in different ways to that, which I think sometimes changes the relationship of the school to its local place, if it has a population that's coming in from elsewhere. But I think that at the end of the day, those kinds of things, and Alex and I work on this together, actually those kinds of, again, technologies of school governance, of school district governance, they do disrupt access to education in important ways. They can also foster access in important ways, right? But it doesn't, I think it's like we're sort of testing different technologies when we change the way attendance zones look, or we change assignment policies, or we decide to send kids to school here instead of there, or have a neighborhood school versus a kind of regional or magnet school, right? We're tinkering with that technology, often ostensibly to support more access to the human right of learning and education. But there are, unintended consequences that follow on with that. So I'm not sure that answers exactly the question that was being asked.
Yeah, so I think if you were the poster of that question and you would like a little elaboration, you can post it and we'll go back to it. Here's another question. Are there positive examples you can share of city, county government agencies using principles of human rights to guide land use and public infrastructure? Yeah, I can't think of any off the top of my head. This is pretty bad.
I mean, there are good examples, and like this language of human rights is not usually a language that I use in my work, but I think it's helpful because it's broader than the kind of transportation justice and equity work that I normally do. But there are good examples of cities, and I'm most familiar with kind of local departments of transportation setting up, rather than thinking about justice or equity as something that happens at the end of a planning process, or they get information about because they conducted a certain analysis. They'll in-house set up a shop, like an entire department within a city agency or a city transportation department that's focused on equity. It could be like equity, diversity, inclusion. It could be more kind of justice oriented. But two places that come to mind are City of Seattle has a kind of Office of Transportation Equity, and the City of Portland also has one. And I just saw an RFP come out for another agency that was seeking to create one. It might have been Milwaukee or something, but I think that's a really good way of identifying that justice and in turn access to, or the ability to kind of realize human rights is of concern, and kind of putting your money where your mouth is, hiring staff that share that concern, and then integrating that into every facet of the organization instead of just like one thing that happens at the end.
Yeah, and I will say that going along with Alex, the common process is to have an equity dimension that evaluates plan outcomes versus an equity process that feeds into the plan development. So you're always evaluating at the end, and it's usually a single domain evaluation. So I think shifting that to be a process where every step of the way that you develop the plan, equity is part of that consideration is probably an emerging paradigm, so to speak. All right, so the last question we have is, this is a good one. Are rurals a population that can have inequitable outcomes? And I think this could reflect on all three of your pieces of work. So maybe we have time for each person to go around and offer a final thought on this.
So go ahead. I can start and just say yes, and it's like 100%. And it's not my area of expertise because I work predominantly in urban and suburban communities. But I mean, the issues of education and rural education, the issues of rural poverty that compound issues of education. I mean, there is no question that this is a concern. The role of the school as both a physical and social piece of infrastructure in rural communities, I think, is maybe operates differently, but is just equally as strong as in the kinds of contexts that I spend more time in. But when we see school closures, for permanent school closures in rural communities, the impacts actually can be much more pronounced in terms of inequitable outcomes when we talk about travel times and distances. That students are already taking, hour-long bus trips to get to the one school in their community or two schools. And then if one of those schools closes and they have to go out of county right? I mean, it's really a profound problem. And it's a profound problem because when we think, and this again is why the human rights frame I think is helpful, when we think about the other technologies that are layered and available to people, right? So the transportation infrastructure as a technology that then enables access to education is lacking in rural areas more so than in a dense or urban center. And so again, sort of one sectoral challenge creates multiple and cumulative and compounding harms for the population sort of across the sector. So yes, it's definitely an area that requires its own attention and understanding because the context really matters.
So Matt?
Sure, I would say yes, absolutely. Including, in addition to rural, but as sort of a related category, remote communities and remote indigenous communities as well. And in terms of interventions that come to mind, I know that, here in New England, there's lots of efforts in places like Vermont to try and support new forms of transit access to rural communities through things like on-demand transit. And here in Massachusetts, there's a lot of resources put towards medical transportation for residents in rural areas, because it is a very serious issue.
Those are good points. Thank you. And Alex, you want to
Sure.
cap it off?
Yes, I would agree. Also, I think that especially when we talk about like thinking about inequitable outcomes, it's often helpful to differentiate between people who, and this is super relevant for transportation, people who choose a certain way of life or choose a certain location, a residential or workplace location, and those who are have less choice, were unable to choose, or were otherwise forced into a situation. And so yes, rural populations, sure, but I'm less concerned about folks who willingly made the choice to live in a rural community. And to be clear, like they should be free to choose that. I'm more concerned about people who find themselves in that situation and would rather live close to public transit, would rather not have to endure long commute trips by car. And so we should focus our attention on those people and not the kind of broader group of just rural populations more broadly.
Well, so I think that's it for us and this session. I would like to thank anybody who's out there in the ether for joining us. The questions were great, and my heartfelt thanks to Ariel, Matt, and Alex for sharing their research, and I hope everyone enjoyed the session. So thank you very much, and thank you, Jonathan, for helping us.